Hey guys, this is Mr. V over here doing a book review today for Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Before I get into my book review, I want you guys to know that I always try to do a spoiler-free book review, so if you see me looking down occasionally, I just have notes so not to give any spoilers away. So, let's get into the book review for Uncle Tom's Cabin. So, the main premise for Uncle Tom's Cabin is a fictional book about the life of slavery and what it was like to be a slave, and also what it was like for the owners of the slave, and just the general things that happened. Before you get into this book, you should know that this book was released in 1852, so that was almost a decade before the American Civil War, so slavery was still legal in the South, and there was still a lot of slave trades going on in the South, and that slaves were thought of as property, and that you could sell them, and they were just sold for money, and that's why they were thought of as property. And you also want to be aware that this book uses racist terminology because it was released in 1850s, so in those days they were not considered racist terms. So you just want to be aware of that before getting into the book. Now, let's get into the book review. So this book was definitely a very interesting book. I would say that this book was an interesting book, but it was a tough and a raw book to read. It was definitely very raw because it portrays the life of slavery, like the life of a slave, which is very, very tough reading because you get to see how the slaves live, how they talk to each other, how they talk to their owners, how are they treated, and how they can just be sold in a second. They can just be sold in a second and that's it. And then how some of them, after they're sold, they take off running and what happens and like how that whole thing goes on. And the book also shows and talks about slave hunters, and that's a very scary thing about how these people go out, they capture the slaves, bring them back for money, but how ruthless they can be. And that's why I say this was a very, very tough and raw book because you get to see you get to read all of that stuff. And while it is fictional, you know this type of stuff really did happen. So it's definitely a raw book, but it was still very interesting. Now, I would say that this kind of had an odd start to the book because you're kind of just thrown right into the middle of a conversation as within the first chapter or two, a slave is sold and then a slave takes off. And that just happens almost immediately. And that's why I said you're almost just like thrown right into the middle of a slave trade. And that's why it was kind of an odd start. It was not slow. I don't know how to describe it, but there was something just odd about the start. But something made you want to keep reading. Something made you want to keep reading, and then it started to draw you in more and more, and then it really got going, and it just took off from there. And there was just so much emotion after that point, and it was just amazing reading it, and like how you get drawn into the book so much. And what the book is basically broken up into two main stories. Both are about slaves, but it's broken up into two main stories. And what the author did was they would go back and forth between the stories. The stories would occasionally overlap, but for the most part they did not overlap. But you would kind of have, so you'd go back and forth between the two stories where there'd be like 3 chapters for one story, and then it would go 5 chapters for another story, and then go back to the original story for another 3 chapters, and they just kept going back and forth like that throughout the whole book. And, you know, there were characters for each of those main stories. So just be aware that it is basically 2 main stories. But those main stories, they definitely make you think. They make you think a lot. And because you do wonder, you know, this is about 150 years later, but it makes you wonder, it's like, what would it be like to be a slave? And, you know, how tough that would be. That the biggest thing is that how you could just be sold in a second, and how it would break up families, or your spouse could be sold, your children could be sold. And it wasn't only the slaves sometimes, but even the owners sometimes did not want to sell their slaves, but they needed they needed money for something, or the spouse was like, don't sell this person, I don't want their family to be broken up. But then they had no say. It was the slave owner just sold them. And it was very interesting, but also very tough. It was very tough reading it, but that's what captured you. And that's what made it a very powerful book, because it really captured you. And one thing I really loved about the book was that it showed the true life of a slave. Like, it portrayed a true life in the relationships they had with their owners, the kind of talk they had with their owners, how sometimes after they were traded and they met other slaves, some slave owners were considered good slave owners, others were considered a bad slave owner, and how some of those slave owners did treat their slaves decently. Now, with that being said, these were still slaves, and I want you to know that I believe slavery is bad and immoral, but when I mean they were considered good slave owners, as in the book, is that they did not, this is not a book where these owners did not just beat their slaves. You know, it is not just, oh, they were beating them nonstop or abusing them nonstop like that. You know, because that's a lot of times like what you think. And even I thought that going into this book, this is going to be like that. And it wasn't like that. There were some of the owners they portrayed that did beat their slaves. And, you know, that is tough. But some of the owners had respect for, like, maybe if slave wasn't feeling well, to say, okay, take the day off or take the week off. Or if they had some kind of opinion, they would listen. So that's why it showed the conversations they had and the relationships they had, and how some of them really were caring. You know, some of the spouses or some of the kids really were caring for the slaves. Again, I need to reiterate, I am completely against slavery, but it just shows what the true relationship was of slavery. And this was, again, released in the 1850s. So it showed this is really what was going on. But that's what made the book so much more powerful. Because it just felt very realistic in showing that there were some horrible owners, but there were still some that treated them well. And it was just because it was believable, and that's what made it very powerful. Now, some of the things I did not like about the book. One of the big aspects I did not like about the book was the dialogue was tough at times, because the dialogue, the way it was written, you can tell that it was meant, like the dialogue was meant to sound like an uneducated person speaking with like a southern accent. So sometimes you'd have to go back and you have to like reread it to make sure you understood what was going on. And that would sometimes take away from the scene. So that was one thing that was a little tough. Not all the dialogue, but some of the dialogue was that way. And you could tell just they were trying to use slang or things, and it made it a little tough at times. And one of the things that I didn't like about the book as well was that I said it was kind of an odd start, but it was not a bad start. But I thought that the middle of the book dragged a bit, because you really got drawn into the book, and then one of the stories really dragged for a bit. But then it started to pick up again towards the end, and it recovered towards the end. So it ended well. But yeah, the middle did drag a bit. So that was one of the things I did not like. Now, as for the writing style for this book, I thought this was a very well-written story. Not only the storylines, but also the descriptions was very good. I thought the thoughts that they did were very good, because you're showing what different people thought. And overall, the conversations were good. The dialogue was tough at times, but not all the dialogue was tough. And the conversations felt real. And I thought that she did a great job of writing that. But also the writing, I said, it just felt very realistic. It was written in 1852, or released in 1852. So I think this is pretty realistic, that while it is a fictional book, I have a feeling a lot of the stuff really did happen like this. So that's why it doesn't feel fake or anything like that, and that's what captures you. But, you know, I definitely thought it was a very interesting book. Now, I'm going to give it my official rating right now. So I always rate my book on a scale of 0 to 10, with a 0 being an awful book, a 5 is an average, and a 10 is phenomenal. If it gets anywhere near 10, that should be on your reading list, because I'm a very tough critic, and a 5 is average. So, for Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, I am going to rate this book an 8, which for me is very high in my rating system. And the reason I'm rating it an 8 is because this was a very, very powerful book. It was very powerful. It was very interesting. I said it portrayed the true life of slavery and what it was like for some of the owners, and just how some were good and some were just horrible, and just it portrayed the life so well, and you just felt so captured during the book that you just wanted to continue to read it. And the author just did a great job of doing that and just portraying everything. So if you guys have any comments or questions, please post it in the comment section below. I hope you guys click the subscribe button, as I always upload multiple different types of book reviews. But thank you for watching my book review today. This is Mr. V. Enjoy reading.